In September 2011, I flipped open my copy of InStyle magazine, which had Beyonce on its cover. Her story had a lot in it that I liked, but what I remember most clearly about it is her saying that women who don't have female friends frighten her. And I don't think I've ever related so strongly with Beyonce in my life, excepting maybe if I were a boy and single ladies. I really wish I still had my copy of that magazine so I could quote the exact words she used, maybe pick apart why I identified with her so strongly in that moment. But in any case, what's relevant is that when a woman says that she doesn't have any female friends, an alarm starts blaring in my head. These days, we have terms to describe that type of woman, right? Pick me and not like other girls come to mind. And I suppose I'm glad that there appears to be a consensus that those are negative descriptions. We're in the middle of the era of the girl's girl, though there's an ongoing discussion about what exactly that means. There's also some criticism of the girl's girl, and let's just call her GiGi for now, for brevity. And I also have some criticism of GiGi that I'll get into later, but right at this moment, being a GiGi is generally considered a good thing. But when I was growing up, that wasn't exactly the case. It used to be the thing that girls would say, "Oh, I don't have any girlfriends because I just get along better with boys." And that used to be lauded by both girls and boys. I know because while I never expressly said those words, I did have more friends who were boys than girls when I was growing up. It was boys who championed me, who did the things I wanted to do, who were more comprehensible to me because I was growing up with more boys than girls in my household. For much of my young life, I was the cool girl in the most 90s way you can imagine. Yes, cringe. And then things abruptly shifted. So, when I was about 8 years old, I got my period. My mother also had her period around the same age, so I wasn't really surprised when I got my period. She made sure to prepare me for what having a period would be like. But what neither of us was ready for was how quickly my body changed after that. I don't think I can fully describe to you what it feels like to be 9 years old and have to figure out how to play football with your friends or be a competitive swimmer in your age group while walking around with, in the words of one of my friend's parents, a chest that doesn't belong on any child. I stopped dancing ballet because I just didn't look like the other girls in class. And after one very painful chest binding session that traumatized both me and my dance teacher, everyone agreed I didn't need ballet in my life. So I was a 28D at age 9, which I learned because my mother had me fitted by a professional following an incident with a girl who called me gross because she could still see details of my breasts under my bra and undershirt. It was a terrible year for me because all the other girls I knew weren't like me and didn't know what to do with me. And the boys didn't know what to do with me either because they were too distracted by my boobs. Older guys were also paying me more attention with various levels of creepiness. I was training with my team at the pool when this older athlete asked me on a date. I didn't know it was a date because I thought he was just offering to buy me snacks to be friendly. And he did not know I was 9 until my coach came over to tell me to get back into the pool with the other kids my age. To his credit, the guy turned this really gray shade and ran off, decidedly grossed out by the fact that he'd been attracted to a kid. I'm glad to report that most of my encounters with older guys at that point were similar. Just full on barf cringe at themselves over the fact that they'd hit on a literal primary school kid. Unfortunately, there were a handful of incidents where it got much uglier, and the toss up for the worst are A, when an aunt beat this guy with her umbrella for repeatedly nudging at my chest while we were in line at the grocery store, and B, when this ugly old man called me a bitch for not reacting to him licking his lips and winking at me in the elevator. The first incident was pretty bad because I can still remember how he'd accidentally grope me while pushing his cart or reaching for some random item that was nowhere near me. Because I was too shocked to speak, it happened a few times before my aunt realized what was happening, and she just reached into her handbag for her umbrella and started bashing away, which was awesome. The staff tried to restrain her at first, but when I finally found my voice and told them that he'd been groping me, not only did they throw him out, but they made sure that he was never allowed to shop there again. This second incident was intense because the police got involved. I was out on a school trip that had our class away for the weekend, and we were staying in this really nice downtown hotel. I went to the pool because I wanted to get a little training in despite being away. And when I headed back to my room, I got into the elevator with a bellhop and this old white guy who sized me up in the disgusting way I described earlier. I just looked away and decided to ignore him, but then he snapped and said, "Fucking bitch." Now, the bellhop knew how old I was, since I was there on a school trip and he'd previously seen me in my school uniform. Also, I was with a friend, and she definitely looked like a 9-year-old. The bellhop didn't confront the other guest directly, but he escorted me to the front desk and got a hold of my principal, and we later called my parents. Predictably, the old guy was a sex offender, so in some ways, I'm glad it happened because he was put away again. But the reason this incident is in some ways worse than the other one with my aunt is because before she called my parents, my principal took me aside to lecture me about what I was wearing. While I was no longer in my bathing suit when I got into the elevator, I was still dressed too skimpily, according to her. I told my mother about this later, so she had a huge argument with the principal over it, and my mother made sure I understood that the victim blaming I experienced was also wrong. All these experiences are hard to talk about now. So you can imagine what it was like to have to deal with them then. I couldn't talk about it with the other kids, not at first. The boys just didn't understand why I didn't just punch the guy who was touching me, or why the police were called because some old guy looked at me wrong and said mean things to me. Then the other girls started having their periods too, and their bodies started changing. Maybe not as dramatically as mine did that one year, but before long I had this sisterhood, this commonality among us that bonded us. Don't get me wrong, again, I had female friends prior to puberty, and I've never not had a girl clique. But being the first in my year who had her period, the first to experience those bodily changes, the first to experience the reaction to those bodily changes, when I saw my peers going through them, I got it immediately. I was the person who understood. In many ways, your smart older sister was at this older sistering for decades. And it didn't just feel good to be the one to know what to do or how to help. It felt like a duty. I wasn't just there for the girls who were my friends. I felt like I had to be there for all the other girls. And I expected that all the other girls should be there for all us girls. For example, I had pads and tampons on me even when I wasn't on my period because a girl in my class got her period on a day when none of us had any. No one taught me this explicitly, mind you. It was just this almost automatic sense of, oh, I need to help her. And I definitely expected that if I needed help, I should be able to go to other girls for help. This became very clear to me in fifth grade. There was this one girl who no one really liked because she was really prim and judgmental. She got up for recess one class, and right on her seat was this bright scarlet smear. One of my closest friends then, the same girl who was with me in the elevator with that pedo creep, she just pointed and went, "Ew!" before screaming with laughter. I managed to cover the girl's skirt and legs with my sweater, but I couldn't do anything about the chair before people saw it. And I don't think I need to describe how cruel children can be. She ran out, and even before the teacher came in to scold all of us for being mean and insensitive, I was already having an intense argument with my friend about how we shouldn't laugh at other girls. I didn't have the terminology or breadth of understanding then to explain why I was so upset over a girl who wasn't our friend and I didn't remotely like. But to my nascent feminist mind, it was already clear to me that, like it or not, girls were a group, and we didn't do that to people in our group. This tendency can go too far, right? I'm sure you can already think of any number of ways that being on Team Girl always and forever can cause issues. And the first one I'd like to talk about is how every now and again, allegiance to the sisterhood can conflict with principles like fairness and even whether we perceive something as right or wrong. Now, personally, I don't like to use the term misandry because too often it's misunderstood to be the equivalent of misogyny. As a feminist, I can talk about misogyny all day. In fact, the first version of this script had about 3 pages where I talk about misogyny. But on revision, I actually feel like to talk about misogyny at length in this video would be to bury the lead. I do talk about it a bit later on, but for this part of our discussion, I think we can assume that we all know what we mean when we talk about misogyny. It is the hatred of women, this prejudice that, whether conscious or not, has kept women secondary to men in society through implicit and explicit norms. There are hundreds of thousands of materials out there about misogyny by feminists who are better than me. So if you feel like you need a refresher course on what misogyny is, hit pause, open a new tab, and go look for them. This video will be here when you get back. To return, the reason I don't like to use the word misandry is because I don't think it approaches the scope of what we're talking about when we talk about misogyny. So very briefly, misandry is man-hating. It's disliking someone for being a man. It is also bad, as I think we can agree that any kind of sexism isn't good, but it is nowhere near as pervasive, ingrained, violent, or constricting as misogyny. So, for a very clear example, when we talk about the practice of infanticide, which is the killing of babies, anthropologists will tell you that this practice occurred everywhere in the world at some point for various reasons. However, when we talk about the killing of babies that is prevalent to this day, we are talking about babies who are killed because they are female. There are places and cultures in our world where the preferred sex is male. So when the baby pops out and it's not a boy, they kill it. Now, I won't name the countries where this is still done. You can look that up on your own. But I don't think you'll be able to point to a country or culture in this day and age where babies are killed just because they are male. So, yes, man hating is bad, but it is not the same as what we are talking about when we talk about hate for women. Not every feminist is Valerie Solanas or Andrea Dworkin. And even Andrea Dworkin, probably my favorite radical feminist because she's such a genius, is nowhere near as extreme as Valerie Solanas, who, in her Scum Manifesto, advocated for the creation of the Society for Cutting Up Men, whose moral imperative was the elimination of the male sex because all men are apparently incomplete females, rendered deficient by the Y chromosome. Plenty of feminists agreed that Valerie was too extreme, and some of them even thought that the Scum Manifesto was satire when she published it in 1967. Then, of course, she shot Andy Warhol, so anyway, why are we talking about this? I'm not saying that when you're a girl's girl, when you're a GG, you run the risk of becoming a man-hater. I'm not saying that. I just think that there is some nuance to a common criticism of girl power feminism, that its rules and principles are selective in favor of women. Now, to be clear, 9 times out of 10, I just play the world's tiniest violin for every person complaining about how feminism is bad, how feminism ruined their lives, feminism is why they can't get a date, blah, 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 blah. Grow up. But, in certain instances, I agree that things can get muddied. And if you've been thinking about this as long as I have, you probably already know what instance I'm going to talk about. In 2011, before I read that Beyoncé interview, I was approached about a case involving possible sexual assault. So, to keep it concise, some high school kids had a party, became very inebriated. One kid attempted to have sex with another, and the other person did not have the capacity to consent. A big reason that the case didn't make it to court is because the victim of the assault was a boy and the perpetrator was a girl. Excepting one person at the party who was thankfully strong enough to haul the girl off of the boy, no one intervened because they all assumed that he would be okay with what was happening. Because the one climbing on top of him and yanking off his clothes was a girl. To quote one of the witnesses, it didn't look like assault. She's rare, but there is a version of the GiGi who would defend the perpetrator in that case. You know who she is, right? She'll talk about how women aren't as strong and powerful as men, so it isn't quite the same, and what 5'11" guy can't fight off a 5'2" woman. Women are just naturally more affectionate, and unlike a man, she'd have stopped if she knew he wasn't okay with what was happening. The reason those lines sound like quotations is because I'm quoting from my notes from when I was interviewing witnesses. Most of the perpetrator's girlfriends outright condemned her behavior, but there were 3 who honestly seemed surprised that there was even a budding case and were truly offended on her behalf. That kind of GG is the more extreme version of the GG who says, well, of course it's okay when men do it, but when women do it, then you have a problem. This more common GG is the kind of GG who is usually right about misogyny, who can taste it in the water, even when it's only 1 in 10,000 parts per milliliter. But in her desire to defend a sister, she turns that critical eye only towards the misogyny, when that may not be the heart of the issue. What's an example? Let's talk about age gap relationships, or any relationship where there's an imbalance of power that makes it inappropriate. A few years ago, a cousin of mine went into an in-depth rant about Aaron and Sam Taylor Johnson's relationship, which she felt really grossed out by. For those of you who are as clueless as I was back then, Aaron Taylor Johnson is an actor whom I first saw in Shanghai Nights, released in 2003. 6 years later, he was in the film Nowhere Boy, directed at age 17 by his 40-year-old future wife, Sam Taylor Johnson. The 23-year age gap is one thing, but the fact that they met under circumstances where he's still developing into an adult and she's exerting power and influence over him in a film that delves into a mother-son dynamic. You know how Justice Stewart once defined obscenity as, "I know it when I see it"? For me, that same logic sort of applies here. So yeah, having learned all that about the Taylor Johnsons, I got what was icky about it for my cousin. I can't remember what the trigger was for this rant, but a mutual friend of ours jumped in to criticize my cousin for having double standards because men do it all the time, but of course you're only grossed out when women do it. This was, of course, not true because my cousin also boycotts Leonardo DiCaprio films because of his dating history, which has so many memes at this point that I could probably fill the screen with them. But that particular rejoinder from our mutual friend is so common, I think, because there's a grain of truth in it. As women, I do think that while we're quick to rally to a sister's side, we're also meaner to a sister when we feel like she's letting the side down. Women expect more from other women. Being a GiGi is in many ways complying with expectations that women place upon one another. And God help you if you don't comply. For example, and I really don't want to use this one because I don't really want to wade into any discourse regarding the people involved, but as it's the only one I could think of off the top of my head, let's recall what Maya Banbury said publicly when Taylor Swift started dating Maya's ex, Travis Kelce. In an interview with the Daily Mail, she alleged that Travis had cheated on her and issued a, quote, "once a cheater, always a cheater" warning thus. Taylor seems like such a fun girl with a beautiful spirit, so I wish her the best of luck. But I wouldn't be a girl's girl if I didn't advise her to be smart. She also implied that Kelce was using Taylor and that by now Taylor must have mastered the ability to see who is really there for her. Now, reading that for the first time, I really wanted to take the words at face value and extend as much grace to Maya, who was dealing with a lot of bizarre and frankly racist sludge just for being Travis Kelce's ex-girlfriend. But I also couldn't help but get a whiff of cattiness. Because what is Taylor Swift supposed to do with this information? Every single sentence in that interview seems to point to a very clear conclusion. As a GiGi, I am telling you all of this because I think you should dump him. And if you are also a GiGi, which I think you claim to be, knowing how he treated me, you would dump him. And naturally, The follow-up thought to these allusions is, what does it say about you that you are not dumping this garbage guy? I'm sure there are some of you at this point who are thinking, big sis, you are reaching. Maya probably didn't mean any harm and just wanted to let Tay Tay know in good faith. Let's set aside the fact that this was done publicly, when she could very well have just sent a private message with her concerns, if concerns were all they were. My reservations about the interview were confirmed when page 6 caught Maya liking a comment on Instagram where someone called Taylor Swift a 5. Come on. We know what that is, right? Any woman who's been the new girlfriend or even the ex-girlfriend knows what that is, right? The fact that it's dressed up as a girl power, I'm just trying to be there for another girl move, makes it so much worse because it misuses the strength of the movement for malicious purposes. Suddenly, this is not about lingering feelings of betrayal, rejection, and jealousy. This is about being a girl's girl. And this incident really underscores my biggest problem with the GiGi, as much as I want to love her. There's something in being a GiGi that we all sort of think, oh, she's just a woman who makes other women feel good. First of all, you're describing a lesbian. Okay. Yeah, okay. I was just really attached to that joke, okay? More seriously, the corollary question to that definition is, when you make other women feel bad, even unconsciously, does that exclude you from being a GiGi? I knew a girl in high school who was really smart and kind of chubby. And midway through sophomore year, she started dieting. There was this one lunch where we happened to sit by each other's tables, and I overheard her friend group being really supportive towards her by telling her that she didn't need to diet, that she was perfect the way she was, yada yada. And then one of them joked that she should leave something for the rest of us because you can't be pretty, thin, and smart. And yes, the moment she shed the excess weight, a few people in that friend group had a hell of a lot to say about her that wasn't very friendly. That's simply envy, right? Envy taking cover under the wording of feminine solidarity to pressure you into thinking that being a sister is about doing everything in your power, even when it's not healthy or helpful to you, to accommodate the whims and insecurities of other women. I thought about talking about envy at length here, but when I was editing my script, I realized that other women have already created some really good material on this subject as it applies to women. So if you want to go deeper into this subtopic, let me refer you. First, ContraPoints did a really great video on envy a few years ago that tackled envy in the women's movement, among other things, which I strongly recommend you go see if you haven't already. As a mostly Asian person who was socialized to be acutely aware of eliciting envy, it always blew my mind how free many North Americans were from the concept, at least on the surface. So I was so tickled when Natalie took it up because she has a way of doing these really comprehensive yet comprehensible dives into these subjects. Her video goes into how envy is a universal drive, how it's more common for women to envy other women precisely because of our commonalities, and how envy can poison movements. Second, there's this short journal article by Jean Wyatt published in 1998 about envy as depicted in Margaret Atwood's The Robber Bride. I first read it in 2008 through my department's JSTOR, but reading it again now I had to pay $12, which might seem a bit steep. It is a bit steep, honestly. But I promise it's totally worth it if you're a social studies nerd and you've already read The Robber Bride and need to process all the complicated feelings it evokes. So if you haven't read The Robber Bride, very briefly, it deals with three women who have this sort of support group to process how they were screwed over in various ways by a mutual friend named Xenia. I know most of us know and hopefully love Margaret Atwood for The Handmaid's Tale, but The Robber Bride is my personal favorite because it confronts the complexities in women's relationships with one another. I love Jean White's article on The Robber Bride because she tackles what really jumped out at me when I was reading that book as a reformed mean girl fresh out of high school. Wow, that is a lot of envy. I won't spoil anything in the novel or the article, but again, if you want sources who do a better job at discussing this than I do here, consider yourselves referred. Okay, back to my point. Okay, back to my point. I feel like the inevitable existence of envy and competitiveness among women makes it impossible for any woman to truly be a GiGi. And therefore, the GiGi as a construct is just another tool for holding back individual women and women as a collective. I feel like it's a truth generally accepted among feminists that our community is still undermined by ugliness that stems from envy and competitiveness. But instead of addressing these realities openly, we don't really talk about them as much because it's deeply uncomfortable. I'm deeply uncomfortable right now because there's a part of me that worries that the misogynists will seize onto this part of the video and misconstrue it. But I do think that reflection and discussion of these matters does help me, as a woman and a feminist, understand myself and the sisterhood that I'm devoted to. I think that it's great that most of the time when we're talking about feminists, we're defending feminism, we are focused on empowering women, and that these days you can kind of just expect women to be feminists. Like it's no longer a bad word. Unlike when I was coming up, when being a feminist generally meant being angry, too argumentative, and just altogether unreasonable. So I love this for us. At the same time, I do think that it's good to pause now and again and consider trends in modern feminism just to check if this is something we actually want to pervade our community and discourse. This whole GiGi discourse and where it seems to be heading reminds me of something that the feminist activist, writer, and lawyer Joe Freeman wrote in April 1976, trashing the dark side of sisterhood. This is the woman who wrote the Bitch Manifesto, essentially sparking the reclamation of the word bitch, and yet she experienced what it was like to be shunned by other feminists because she wasn't feminist enough according to their standards. In discussing the women's movement's tendency towards self-destruction, she brings to light something we still don't like to talk about in the sisterhood: women taking down other women. The means vary. Trashing can be done privately or in a group situation, to one's face or behind one's back, through ostracism or open denunciation. The trasher may give you false reports of what horrible things others think of you, tell your friends false stories of what you think of them, interpret whatever you say or do in the most negative light, project unrealistic expectations on you so that when you fail to meet them, you become a legitimate target for anger, deny your perceptions of reality, or pretend you don't exist at all. The fact that this happens is simply reality, right? It's been almost 50 years since Joreen wrote that article, and we're not only still trashing one another for various reasons, there are still women who use feminism as a cover for trashing other women. Towards the end of her article, Joreen writes, "With each new story, my conviction grew that trashing was not an individual problem brought on by individual actions, nor was it a result of political conflicts between those of differing ideas. It was a social disease. The disease has been ignored so long because it is frequently masked under the rhetoric of sisterhood. In my own case, the ethic of sisterhood prevented the recognition of my ostracism. The new values of the movement said that every woman was a sister, every woman was acceptable. I clearly was not. Yet no one could admit that I was not acceptable without admitting that they were not being sisters. It was easier to deny the reality of my unacceptability. With other trashings, sisterhood has been used as the knife rather than the cover-up. A vague standard of sisterly behavior is set up by anonymous judges who then condemn those who do not meet their standards. As long as the standard is vague and utopian, it can never be met. But it can be shifted with circumstances to exclude those not desired as sisters." And there, in those last two sentences, is the problem. So, should the GiGi exist? And by that, I mean, should the GiGi as an ideal exist? I think you can intuit from this whole video that my answer at this time is no. As much as I'd like to think that the GiGi is just a feminist's ideal feminist, it's also plain to me that this ideal is too often weaponized against other women. There are a number of reasons we've discussed as to why this happens, but central to each of them is the fact that the ideal in itself is just too amorphous because
it is literally impossible to be a woman.
That doesn't mean we should stop advocating for ourselves as women or that we should check the instinct to be there for other women. I think the notion of the GiGi stems from this very positive desire to be helpful to others with whom we share lived experiences. As I felt very early on as a child, where I think things begin to spiral is when we use that urge as a premise for a less noble conclusion, or as a cover for something else, or as something to constrict other women with. As with many things about being a woman, or in general, just being a person, this is something I've thought about and I'm still thinking about. What do you think? Sorry this video is so late, by the way. Your smart older sister has a job.